Welcome to today's Explainer. I'm Dr. Chem, and we are embarking on a true cinematic lecture into the fascinating world of statistical investigation. We aren't solving crimes with fingerprints or DNA here. We are solving mysteries using data. In research, business, and science, we're just constantly bombarded with numbers and claims. But how do we actually uncover the hidden truths? How do we know for sure if a new drug works, if a marketing campaign literally drove sales, or if a data point is just a random coincidence? Well, that is the magic of statistical hypothesis testing. We're going to decode this entire process from the ground up, so you can start interrogating data like an absolute pro.
Here is the roadmap for our statistical journey today. First, the hypothesis testing mystery. Second, the four-step process. Third, mastering the z-test. Fourth, 1 versus 2 sample tests. And finally, avoiding statistical errors.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the hypothesis testing mystery.
Okay, so whenever you're looking at a sample of data, let's say a survey of 100 people or the test scores of just a single classroom, you've got to remember you're only seeing a tiny slice of the world. Because sampling always involves some level of uncertainty, anytime you see a difference or a trend, you have to stop and ask yourself this exact question. Is this effect actually real, or did we just happen to pull an unrepresentative sample by pure chance? Is it just a fluke? Hypothesis testing is the core mathematical framework we use to answer that exact question.
To crack this case, we have to establish a baseline. So, meet our prime suspect, the null hypothesis, often written as H0. You can think of the null hypothesis exactly like the presumption of innocence in a courtroom. In statistics, we always assume no effect, no difference, or no relationship until the evidence absolutely forces us to conclude otherwise. The burden of proof is entirely on the data to prove that something interesting is actually happening.
Let's ground this with a really great example from our sources. Imagine a movie theater manager who wants to know if a brand new employee is filling popcorn bags correctly. Now, the strict theater standard is exactly 8 cups per bag. Our null hypothesis here is that there's no difference at all. The new employee is perfectly hitting that 8-cup average. Our alternative hypothesis, HA, is the exact opposite. A difference exists. And because we don't know if the employee is overfilling or underfilling those bags, we just state that the average does not equal 8. This sets up what we call a two-tailed test, meaning we're on the lookout for a fluke in either direction.
Moving along to Section 2, the four-step process.
Our source material outlines this beautiful, perfectly logical, four-step process that remains exactly the same no matter how complicated the math gets. Step 1. State your hypotheses, both the null and the alternative. Step 2. Find your critical values, which are essentially the thresholds of evidence you require. Step 3. Collect your data, calculate your test statistic, and figure out your effect size. And Step 4. Compare your statistic to your critical value and make your final decision. You either reject the null or you fail to reject it.
Now, step 2 of that process requires us to set a firm threshold, and that threshold is usually driven by this number right here, 0.05. This is our alpha, or our significance level. What this means in plain everyday terms is that we're willing to accept a 5% probability of a false positive. We are demanding that our data be so extreme that there is less than a 5% chance we'd see these results if the null hypothesis were actually true.
And notice how that 5% alpha translates into a physical boundary on a graph. For a standard two-tailed test, the critical z-value is 1.96. If you calculate your test statistic and it falls somewhere between negative 1.96 and positive 1.96, well, the evidence just isn't strong enough. But if it falls beyond those numbers, you've crossed the bright line. You are officially in the rejection region, and you can confidently say your result is statistically significant.
All right, Section 3, Mastering the z-test. The absolute crucial point here is knowing exactly when and how to pull the z-test out of your analytical toolbox. You don't just use it for everything. As our sources explicitly point out, you use a z-test only when you already know the population standard deviation, meaning you know exactly how the data naturally varies, or when your sample size is delightfully large, which means 30 or more observations. If you have a really small sample and you do not know the population standard deviation, you have to estimate it, and that's when you absolutely must use a t-test instead.
Let's look at a fantastic, highly relatable scenario from the LibreText source to see a one-tailed z-test in action. Imagine your office building is supposed to be kept at a comfortable 74 degrees Fahrenheit, and you happen to know it naturally varies by exactly 1 degree. But lately, it feels sweltering. You suspect management is secretly letting it run hot to save money on air conditioning. Your null hypothesis is that the temp is 74. Your alternative hypothesis is specifically that the temperature is greater than 74.
So, you play detective. You secretly record the temperature for 5 days, and you find an average of 76.6 degrees. We have a known standard deviation of 1.00, so we run our z-test formula. We take our sample mean, subtract the population mean, and divide by the standard error. Boom, the math spits out an obtained z-statistic of 5.78. Remember our critical value threshold from earlier? Even for a one-tailed test, the threshold is just 1.645. Our result of 5.78 is so far past that line, it's practically off the chart. The null hypothesis is busted. Management definitely has some explaining to do.
But finding a statistical difference doesn't always mean you found a meaningful difference. That is exactly why our process demands we calculate the effect size, commonly measured by Cohen's d. See, a z-test just tells us if a difference is statistically real, but Cohen's d tells us if it actually matters out there in the real world. A d around 0.2 is small, 0.5 is medium, and 0.8 or higher is considered large. In our office temperature example, the effect size calculated to a massive 2.60. It wasn't just a statistical fluke, it was a massively noticeable, sweaty difference.
Which brings us to Section 4, 1 versus 2 sample tests.
Everything we just looked at with the popcorn and the hot office was a one-sample test. We had one sample of data, and we compared it to a known benchmark or an advertised value. But very often, researchers want to compare two entirely separate groups to each other. For example, testing the resting heart rate of men versus women, or comparing how effective a brand new drug is against a traditional one. That requires a two-sample test, which adjusts the underlying math to properly account for the variability in both of those independent groups.
There's also a special third configuration to keep in mind: paired data. This is when your two samples are actually dependent on each other. The classic example is measuring the exact same subjects twice, like testing a student's score before a training program and then testing that exact same student's score after. Because the measurements are paired to the individual, the math zeroes in purely on the difference between those two scores, giving you an incredibly precise look at the treatment's real effect.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, avoiding statistical errors.
The reality is, whenever you make a decision to reject or retain a null hypothesis, there is a chance you're just plain wrong. Our sources provide this excellent justice system analogy. Just take a look at the grid. If the null hypothesis is true, meaning the person is innocent, but our verdict is guilty, we commit a type 1 error. We reject a true null. We essentially send an innocent person to jail. Conversely, if the alternative hypothesis is true and the person is actually guilty, but our data leads to a not guilty verdict, we commit a type 2 error. We fail to reject a false null, letting a guilty person walk free.
Notice the overlapping distributions on this chart. That vertical red line is our alpha, our 0.05 significance level threshold. We deliberately set that line to limit our type 1 error. We just have to accept that 5% of the time, pure random chance will push a perfectly innocent sample from the blue distribution over that red line, causing us to falsely cry wolf. But if we try to move the line further to the right to stop those false alarms, we dramatically increase the shaded area of the green distribution that falls to the left of the line, meaning we increase our type 2 error, failing to detect true effects when they're actually right there. It is always a trade-off.
And this is exactly where the classical frequentist approach of rigidly setting your alpha to 0.05 receives some heavy criticism. As the Bayesian decision theoretic framework source points out, not all errors are created equal. The costs are highly asymmetric. Think about it. A type 1 error might mean approving a medical drug that is completely ineffective but highly toxic. A type 2 error, though, might mean failing to approve a drug that would safely cure a deadly disease. Setting an arbitrary 0.05 threshold completely ignores the horrific real-world consequences of those distinct mistakes. Bayesian models argue we should calculate the optimal decision by explicitly minimizing the expected loss, perfectly balancing the evidence against the specific human cost of being wrong.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for you as a statistical detective. Math and formulas are absolutely essential for evaluating evidence, but they cannot make your final judgment for you. When you design your next test, don't just blindly accept a 5% error rate because it's traditional. Look at the context. Ask yourself, is a false alarm worse than a missed opportunity? In your next big data-driven decision, what is the true cost of being wrong? Thank you so much for joining this cinematic lecture. I'm Dr. Kem, and I'll catch you next time.